Hello everyone, we're going to get started in just a second. Looks like our room is almost full. Sorry that we will soon have to interrupt your intense Rochambeau tournament. Seems like Sandy is destroying everyone from what I can see. All right everyone, we are going to get started. Thanks for being here. You are currently at the 2020 Data Quality Webinar. Thanks for making time to be here today. All HMIS users are required to complete this training in order to maintain their HMIS license. We take this training very seriously and we want all ClientTrack users to understand their responsibilities. The information provided in this training is all based on the 2020 data standards, which were set forth by HUD. We know how busy you all are and how much you all have on your plates, and we know that your jobs can be incredibly challenging, so we appreciate you taking the time to be here to help us improve our COC's data quality. Having that said, I want us to make good use of this time investment. This webinar is incredibly important for a number of reasons, and we ask that you all stay for the entire time so that we can be sure you're up to date on current HMIS practices, and also that we make good use of this time that we've carved out for each other by actively listening to the materials that we're presenting. The only housekeeping item that we have today is just reminding everyone that is sharing screens, if you haven't already, let Craig know by emailing him or by typing it into the chat who all is sharing screens with you. If you don't do that, obviously we won't know that you attended today's mandatory webinar and you will be assigned to take the litmus course. Okay. So I wanted to take a moment just to introduce today's presenters. We have Victoria Lopez, which is THN's Data and Policy Analyst, Antonio, THN's Database Coordinator, myself, Lindsay LaGrange, THN's Training Coordinator, and finally the newest member of the data team, Marissa Ortega, THN's Coordinated Entry Data Specialist. We will all be presenting today's webinar, and we're all members of the THN data team, so if you have any questions or comments about this training or anything HMIS related, please reach out to us. So we have quite a lot on our agenda today. We are here obviously to discuss ways to improve our data entry practices in HMIS. There are a number of common data errors that the data team finds on a regular basis. So today we're going to cover what the most common data mistakes are, how to fix them if possible, as well as how to avoid these mistakes moving forward. First up, I'm going to talk a little bit about why data quality is important and how it affects each and every one of us. After that, Victoria is going to talk about system performance measures, grants and the intake workflow, and finally family members. Then I'm going to dive into client duplication as well as annual assessments. Marissa is then going to cover exiting enrollments as well as the exit destination field. And then she's going to talk about provider profiles. And Antonio is going to wrap up the webinar by covering the UDQ process as well as HMIS help ticket etiquette. And finally, we'll spend a few minutes at the end of the training answering any questions that you might have. Feel free to type any questions into the chat box as well, and we'll try and get those answered as soon as we can. All right, let's get started. So let's take a minute to talk about why data quality is so important. If you're here, I'm assuming it's because you want to work to end homelessness in your community. These common data errors are potentially creating more barriers for our clients as well as diminishing the hard work that you're doing. We want your hard work to be seen and recognized by HUD, and we also want to create a system where all of our clients can navigate seamlessly through to housing. These errors are best seen when running reports that are submitted to HUD, and our rankings or success on these reports do affect our COC's funding, which affects the types of services as well as the amount of services that are available to our clients. So it's in our best interest as well as our clients' best interest to keep our data quality high. Also, if we can use our data to help HUD paint an accurate picture of the problem and identify any patterns of use, then we can better understand how to fully create a working solution. I also wanted to quickly go over timeliness in terms of data entry. So timeliness is very important when striving for accurate data. Data entered in a timely manner reduces human error that occurs when too much time has elapsed between collecting data and then entering that data. It's really easy to forget dates, services, referrals after a few days, especially if you're working in a hectic or busy work environment, as I know most of you are. So therefore, the sooner the data is entered, the better chance the data will be correct. Timely data entry also ensures that the data is accessible when it's needed for monitoring purposes, meeting funder requirements, or responding to requests for information. Ideally, we will complete all data entry in electronic records at the time of service, so direct data entry. This helps cut down on paper use and also human error. However, we know there are occasional circumstances that prevent us from doing direct data entry. If you must do delayed data entry, it's incredibly important that all HMIS workflow questions are represented on your paper intake form. In order to comply with reasonable quality standards, THN has established this policy regarding client record data entry. So emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing projects must enter all information within 1 business day. Coordinated entry, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing, outreach, and supportive services only must enter all intake or assessment information within 3 business days. If we wait longer to enter data, we're running the risk of the client being gone, so we can't ask any potential follow-up questions. I'm now going to hand things off to Victoria to tell us a little bit about system performance measures.
Thanks, Lindsay. It is once again time for me to talk to you guys about system performance measures. So, as many of you already know, SPMs stand for System Performance Measures. We have actually just submitted our 2018-2019 SPMs, and I have a few slides later on that show our progress for the year. I do want to give a very brief refresher on what the specific measures are and what data elements are collected for the measures because, as you've probably guessed, it all ties back to data quality. So HUD has developed the following 7-level system performance measures to help communities gauge their progress in preventing and ending homelessness. Number 1, length of time persons remain homeless. Measure 2, the extent to which persons who exit to permanent housing destinations return to homelessness. Measure 3, number of homeless persons. Measure 4, jobs and income growth for homeless persons in COC program-funded projects. Measure 5, number of persons who become homeless for the first time. We don't actually report on number 6, so I'm going to skip that one. And then number 7, successful housing placement. The purpose of these measures is to provide a more complete picture on how well a community is preventing and ending homelessness. Measure 3, the number of homeless persons measured directly assesses a COC's progress toward eliminating homelessness by counting the number of people experiencing homelessness both at a point in time and over the course of a year. The 6 other measures help communities understand how well they are reducing the number of people who become homeless and helping people become quickly and stably housed. The performance measures are interrelated, and when they are analyzed relative to each other, they provide a more complete picture of system performance. For example, Measure 1, the length of time homeless, encourages communities to quickly rehouse people, while measures on returns to homelessness, like number 2, and successful housing placements, Measure 7, encourage communities to ensure that those placements are also stable. So taken together, these measures allow communities to more comprehensively evaluate the factors that contribute to ending homelessness. For COCs to accurately assess their progress using these measures, they must ensure that their data are as complete and accurate as possible, from data entry to report generation. So I've included links in the resources slide that you can view, and my goal here is not to break down each measure and go over the nuts and bolts, because I think HUD already has excellent resources for that. What I really want to focus on is how this relates back to HMIS and what you can do to prepare. Oops. So each measure looks at a specific set of data elements. However, the following data elements are used in the SPMs as a whole. We have project type, method for tracking emergency shelter utilization, federal partner programs and components, date of birth, project start date, project exit dates, destination, living situation, housing move-in date, and income in sources. So you'll notice that these data points are not necessarily demographic data, and there are a few of these that you don't even enter from your end, like project type or method for tracking emergency shelter utilization. These are set up by the HMIS team on the back end of this system. If you have questions about your own setup, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us and we'll take a look at what you have. A handful of these elements are also going to be starring in the reports that we'll be mentioning later on, like project start and exit dates, destination, and income and sources. All right, so we've got a little background on what the system performance measures are. So I thought I would go over very briefly. I'm not going to spend a long time here talking about this, but the next couple of slides are going to be our 2018-2019 system performance measures. So this is measure 1. It's taking a look at the client's entry and exit nights, or exit dates strictly as they are entered in the HMIS system, and it is giving us the average length of time homeless as well as the median length of time homeless. So one thing that I want you guys to see in metric 1A and well, it's split up into two. The first one on top, we're just looking at people who are in emergency shelter. And then metric 1A on the bottom, we're looking at people who are in emergency shelter and transitional housing. Take a look at how large our universe is for both of those measures. So in emergency shelter, we have over 17,000. And for emergency shelter and transitional housing, we have over 18,000. And that is a significant jump in what we saw from last year. The reason why we have seen that jump is because of the crisis that we had at the border. There were a lot of first-time homeless individuals who entered our system because of that crisis, and these numbers reflect that. The current average length of time homeless for emergency shelter is 29.5 days. HUD rounds that up to 30 days. And then our median length of time homeless is 3 days. And you're probably wondering, well, how can the median length of time be so much smaller than our average length of time homeless? And again, it just ties back to how humongous our universe is. We just had a lot of those first-time homeless people coming in because of the border crisis, and they did not stay in the system very long. And so that's why the median length of time homeless is so much smaller than the average length of time homeless. And the same can be said for the second metric 1A there on the bottom for emergency shelter and transitional housing. Our average length of time homeless is 36.7 days. That would round up to 37. And then again, the median length of time homeless is 3 days. Things look quite a bit different when we are looking at the second half of measure 1A, or excuse me, the second half of measure 1. This is measure or metric 1B. This is looking at something similar, but using different data points. So instead of looking at entry and exit, what we're looking at instead is what the client actually self-reported as their first date of homelessness, or you might be familiar with the data element 3.17, where it asks for length of time homeless. So when we're looking at this, the picture looks very different. We still have quite a large universe for emergency shelter, transitional housing, and now we're including permanent housing. So, you know, our universe is still in the 18,000s. But the average length of time homeless is much, much larger. So you can see for emergency shelter and permanent housing, that average length of time homeless is 124 days, and the median length of time is 6 days. And then once we take into consideration transitional housing on the bottom there, our average length of time goes up a little more to 130 days. And again, you know, that this is not just for the this is not just because we're taking into account what the client self-reports, but also in general, permanent housing projects tend to see longer lengths of stay. So to me, this does not seem abnormal in any way, aside from the gigantic universe that we're looking at. All right, measures 2 and 3. Measure 2 is just looking at returns to homelessness. So if your client was in street outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent housing, and then that client was exited to a permanent housing destination, this Measure 2 gives a percentage of how many of those permanent housing exits actually came back into our system. And we're looking at close to 17% as our return rate. Measure 3 is just looking at the overall universe for emergency shelter and transitional housing. We had a little over 18,000 for emergency shelter and a little over 1,000 for transitional housing. Measure 5 is looking at who entered the system for the first time, who did not have a HMIS enrollment on their dashboard before the reporting period. So again, as I said before, we've seen a lot of new people into our system because of the crisis that we saw at the border. We're still waiting to see if this is something that holds true for our next SPMs, or if this is just kind of a one-off, right? So we're looking at anywhere from 15,500 new people entered the system if we're just looking at emergency shelter and transitional housing, or 16,500 if we're also including permanent housing. I do want to point out, though, that we had over 2,000 people who did have enrollments on their dashboard before this reporting period, right? So these are people that have probably frequented our system more than once or quite a bit. They might even be people that you could recognize by name if you were to run this report on a local level for your community. And so I would like to take some time just to maybe think about what are some strategies that your community could put in place to reach out to those individuals and families, because they're probably some of the clients that, or participants that are the hardest to serve or the hardest to stably house. But if we could get them stably housed, you know, would that free up some resources that you could then use for other clients? All right, Measure 7, we're looking at changes in exits to permanent housing destinations. That first measure up there, 7A1, is just looking at street outreach. And what we see is pretty good. So for street outreach, both permanent housing destinations and temporary destinations count as positive exits. And so out of the 2,300 people who exited street outreach, we had almost 60%. We had 58% exit to a positive destination. So that's really great, especially considering the fact that, you know, some of the populations that are served with the street outreach program, you know, it can be kind of difficult to keep them engaged. So that was really exciting. Measure 7B1, this is changes in exits to permanent housing destinations for emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. We saw that 32 or about 33% of all of our exits for those projects ended in permanent housing, so that's good. And then the last measure, change in exit to or retention of permanent housing. A majority of our clients that were, you know, already enrolled in permanent housing, they either exited to PH or retained their PH status. So it was 95% of those clients. So again, really great numbers there. All right, but how does this tie back to normal day-to-day HMIS? So the SPM data that I just showed is a reminder of all of the hard work you do and where there are some areas for improvement. But the SPMs are really just a once-a-year thing, and we really only bring it to your attention only when we're doing data cleanup and once they've been submitted. Because it's something that we work with at certain times of the year, it can be hard to remember that it's actually an ongoing process, and your normal day-to-day HMIS tasks and data entry, all of that adds up to something much bigger. And you've also probably heard us say this a billion times by now, but the data that you put into the system matters, and it directly affects the reports that we pull and send to HUD, which in turn affects how we are scored as a COC as a whole, which then affects your own agencies, which then affects the clients that you serve. And typically we focus on things like assessments, and we are actually going to cover that later on. But I would like to touch on a couple of different things this time around that we don't always talk about, but they do relate back to SPMs and to just data quality in general. And that is grants and the intake workflow. So what you have heard is probably what's in the workflow is what is required for your program. Or you have heard grant and end dates affect what you see in the workflow, and you have definitely heard us say, contact us immediately if you see something that's kind of weird. Now, some of you may have noticed that at times the basic intake workflow looks a little funky when you're entering data, and we've gotten tickets in the past, in the very recent past, that say something like, I can't enter all of my data into the system, or I think the workflow ended early, or I don't even see my program in the drop-down menu. When the grant date ends for your project in HMIS, the system thinks, okay, well, this program is all wrapped up and it will stop showing you the assessments after the universal data assessment. And you could be missing out on really valuable data if that is the case. Especially if you have to upload your APR or your CAPR to Sage, your upload is going to be impacted. If you're completing the UDQs, your data quality will be impacted. And of course, it impacts our reporting that we send to HUD, like the system performance measures. So regardless of your funding sources, whether you are federally funded or privately funded, there are certain things that you should expect to see in your intake and exit workflows. So these 4 things are included in almost all intakes regardless of funding sources. And I say almost because sometimes the DV assessment is not there, or the income or non-cash benefits isn't there for minors, for example. But these are definitely the things that you should be looking out for. The universal data assessment, barriers, DV assessment, and income or non-cash benefits for your adult clients. And again, if you do not see those, please get in touch with us. I'm actually going to have a small demo a little later of what this looks like. Now, it is extremely important to familiarize yourself with your funding source and its required data elements. If you are unsure what your funding source is, ask your supervisor, or you can contact us and we can help you figure it out. So each funding source has a specific set of required data elements that look different from funding source to funding source, and there's even a significant variation between project types within the same funding source. So if you know for a fact that you are not federally funded, you can still benefit from familiarizing yourself with one of the program manuals. Because of the way our HMIS works, we actually have to set up all programs as if they are federally funded in some way if we want them to be able to collect data like barriers, the DV assessment, and income information. Because of this, if you are not federally funded, chances are your program was set up on the back end to mimic either a HUD COC project type or an ESG project type. And I have hyperlinks on this slide, so please be sure to download this presentation deck in the Today's Materials little pod in Adobe Connect. All right, so what does an ended grant look like in the life site? So if your grant has ended in HMIS, you will only see the universal data assessment and the workflow ends directly after. And I am going to show you what that looks like here in the next couple of minutes. But the last thing I did want to touch on for data quality is how should you edit and update family members and households in HMIS? Because this is another thing that we have seen recently. We've gotten a few tickets asking about family members in HMIS. So in the next few minutes here, I'm going to demo some of the best practices for removing or adding family members. One second while I share my screen. All right, so the first thing that I want to show is what an intake looks like if your grant is funky, if the end date has been entered on your grant. So we're in just the training site. We are in the THN non-shelter HMIS user work group. I'm just going to go ahead and start a really quick intake for my dummy client here. I'm going to use the current client. And then skip over this. Family member information looks good, so I will save and close and move on. I'm going to enter my client into our emergency shelter program. I'm just going to enter my first client here, the ultimate test. Now everything looks good on this page. We have the things that we need to answer, like disabling condition, prior living situation, length of stay, and then don't forget at the bottom here we've got covered by health insurance. So things start getting a little weird once I click the Save button on the bottom right. You'll see that the workflow ended. There was nothing after that universal data assessment. And we'll say, okay, well, we can finish and close the workflow. And we've got our emergency shelter enrollments. But as you can see, if we go and look at the client's assessment, the only thing they have filled out is the HMIS Universal Data Assessment. They do not have their barriers filled out. They don't have the domestic violence assessment filled out. They also do not have the financial assessment filled out. And those are critical. Those are things that we would expect to see in a normal intake for an adult client. So again, if this is something that you are encountering in the live site with your project, please let us know immediately, because it is awful when we run reports and we see that, you know, an agency has diligently entered 100, 200, 300 clients, but none of them have financial information or barrier information. That's data entry that you have to go back and enter if you want your reports to be as clean as possible. All right, the last thing that I'm going to show is our expectations in regards to family members and how you should interact with family members. This, I think, is fairly straightforward, even though it can take a little bit of time to think about. So I'm going to go to the client's family members menu option, and we can see that this client has 3 family members. I'm on Test Ultimate, and they've got some other ultimate clients associated with them. Now, the way that I think about interacting with family members, if there is a family member who is no longer a part of this household, the way that you want to go about this is to think, what is going to involve the least amount of clicks? So one of the things that I have seen is someone says, well, I only want to work with Test Ultimate. These other clients, they're not in the household anymore. I don't know where they are. They're not associated with this project, so I don't want to see them. And then they'll start removing from the family each of the individual clients. And the thing that you need to keep in mind is that when you remove a family member from a household, what you are creating is another household. So if I were to click this little icon and remove the test client from this household, that test client would become their own household, and they would become the self, the head of household of that new family. And you really want to be careful with that, because what we have seen in the training site are children floating around on their own because someone thinks, well, the test child is no longer part of this household, and I don't want to see them in the family anymore, and so they'll remove, you know, a 2-year-old, and then that 2-year-old will be floating around in the system and will not have any associations, but will still have enrollments on their dashboard. So again, something that you want to keep track of. Now, I'm going to say that I just want to work with ultimate tests. they are now on their own. They are no longer part of this household. And so the thing that would involve the least amount of clicks is to just remove ultimate test. So this is going to look a little weird, but I'm going to go to a different family member of this family. So I'm not on ultimate test. I'm going to click on family members again. And now since I'm not on ultimate test, I can remove, and I'm just going to click once, remove from family. And this is much simpler than removing 3 other family members, and then I can go back to the family members of this household and then change the makeup here. So now I'm going to say this test client is actually the head of household, or the self, because every family needs a self. I'm going to go to find clients. And now Test Ultimate is on their own, and they've already been designated as their own head of household. And we can see on the family members page that they do not have any family members associated with them. So this one, I mean, I feel like it's straightforward, but it can take some time to think through. If you are having some issues with family members or don't know how to proceed with a specific household, please let us know, and we can work through it with you. Are there any questions about anything that I have covered before I hand it off? All right, it doesn't look like there are questions. If there are, I will follow up with them. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and pull it back to the PowerPoint.
All right. Thanks, Victoria. Okay. So we're going to move on to the next topic, which is duplicated clients. So let's talk a little bit about that. So what are duplicated clients? I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but bear with me. Duplicate clients are 2 client records in HMIS who represent the same client. The main reason these are accidentally created is when someone does an intake for a client and doesn't realize that that client is already in the system, so they create a new record for that client. Last year, if you remember from our last webinar, we found over 1,200 duplicate clients in our HMIS. So how do they affect HMIS? They make our client universe appear to be much larger than it actually is, which, as Victoria just explained with SPMs, it affects our numbers in a lot of those metrics. And this potentially affects the amount of services that are available in our communities for our clients. For example, System Performance Measure 5, which we just went over, looks at the amount of first-time homeless in our system. So when ClientTrack pulls the data for every new client within the reporting period, it's potentially making it look like we served 1,200 more clients than we actually did. And this number counts against us in terms of productivity on the SPMs. So if you think about SPMs as a type of report card for our COC, duplicate clients are bringing us down a letter grade. So if we can avoid creating duplicate clients, we can avoid muddying our success. Not to mention, duplicate clients affect our clients' ability to access services and can potentially be a barrier to them. So what can we do to avoid these? We really need your help with this. The data team is constantly merging duplicated clients, but we would love to stop them or slow them down from being created altogether. And you can help us with this by doing one thing, and that's really taking a minute or two to search for every single client at intake. I'm going to walk through some examples to help you better understand this issue. So let's make some good searching habits. Always start the intake process by searching for the client. Even if you're confident that they are not in HMIS yet, you should never go straight to that client intake button. You always want to search under Find Client first. And when you search, you need to search broadly. There are many misspelled names in HMIS, so you should go into the search assuming some of the data could be wrong. On top of that, our search function is incredibly finicky, so if you type in one wrong character, your client probably won't come up. Ask the client if they've ever had a name change. I've seen a lot of duplicate clients that were created because the client got married or divorced or just had some kind of a name change. We can always edit a client's last name in HMIS, and we should never create an entirely new record simply because their name changed. That's way more work on your plate, and again, it's creating a duplicate record. And finally, when searching, always search more than once using different fields. So if the client doesn't come up the first time you search for them, pick 2 different fields and try searching again. Okay, so I have an example here for you. So what causes duplicated clients? One of the main reasons they get created is misspelled names. I've seen hundreds of duplicate client records in the system that were created twice because someone misspelled the client's name the first time around. So when the second assessor searched for the client's name, nothing came up. So we're going to use my favorite example, Maria Calhoun. This is fake data, obviously. Let's say Maria presents at an agency for services. However, the assessor who first enters Maria into HMIS is having a crazy busy day and misspells her name. So Marie Calhoun is entered into HMIS. And you might think this is a silly last name, but this is an actual misspelled last name that I pulled from the system. So Marie Calhoun is now in HMIS. And a few months later, Maria presents at a second agency, and this new assessor makes sure to get the correct spelling of the client's name. So she gets all the correct data. The second assessor then searches broadly, as she's supposed to, for the client's name using the first few letters of her name. But because of that misspelling in Maria's last name, when the second assessor searched for it, it doesn't come up. So the second assessor assumes that Maria is not in HMIS and creates a new client ID or a new client record for Maria. So now we have a duplicate. So I'm going to quiz you really quick. Type into the search bar if you know the answer to this. How could this second assessor have found this first client record and avoided making a duplicate? Exactly. Social security number, birth date. You'll see that both assessors got the date of birth and the social security number right. So if the second assessor had tried searching using those fields a second time, they would have found the record and they would have avoided creating a duplicate. Good job, everybody. So 2 takeaways here. One is take time to get all your information correct. I know that things are usually busy, but it's really important. Spelling, dates, etc. And 2, we almost need you to assume that there is potentially bad data in the system and aggressively search for your client. Most of the time, as you see, date of birth and the last 4 of the social can be a safe bet. And if you do find a client in HMIS that has wrong information, we can always change that using that Edit Client button instead of creating more work for yourself and making a whole new record. But we really do need you to take about 1 or 2 minutes to really look for that client so we don't have the amount of duplicates that we have. Okay. One other thing I wanted to touch on, I know a lot of users love to use this search bar at the top, which is totally fine. Instead of clicking on the Find Client icon, which you'll see on the left-hand side there, there are times when it is not appropriate to use this search bar. If you know the client you're working with is in the system, it's someone you've worked with before, absolutely go ahead and do a quick search to find them quickly. However, if you aren't sure that your client is in the system, this is not really a good way to look for them. As you can see, there aren't multiple fields that you can search here, only the one field. So in the last example, we probably wouldn't have been able to find Maria using this search function because we can't really search using birth date. So I would want to click on the Find Client icon on the left menu panel to make sure that Maria isn't already in the system. So as you all know, this is what the Find Client page looks like. And you'll see we have those 7 different fields there. So you have lots of different options to search for your client there. And it's a much more thorough approach to finding someone. Okay, so what do you do with duplicates? If you search for a client during an intake and find that they're already in the system but they have bad data, for Maria, for example, you would confirm that it is the same person and then click on that Edit Client button on your left-hand menu panel and change that bad information to reflect correct data. If you find 2 duplicate records in HMIS that are definitely the same client, then you would send them to us, the data team, and we will merge them for you. When you do that, make sure to include both client ID numbers, and also when we merge clients, all enrollment, services, case notes, and assessments transfer from one ID to the other, and that other ID is discarded. So if there's a client ID that you prefer to keep for record keeping, let us know which one you want to keep. Otherwise, we'll usually keep the older client record and the newer ID will be discarded. Okay. So let's talk about annual assessments. This is one of the largest data quality issues that we see in our COC's data. It's missing annual assessments. Annual assessments are required for every client that is enrolled in your program for over 1 calendar year, even if there have been no changes to that client's information. These must be completed every year that your client is enrolled in your program. So if you have a client that's been enrolled in your program for 3 years, we should see 3 annual assessments, 1 for each year. If possible, do these on the exact anniversary date that your client was enrolled into your program. If that's not possible to create an annual assessment for the client on the exact anniversary date, it is acceptable to create one 30 days before the enrollment anniversary or 30 days after, or any time in between. If we fail to do this for a client, it will show up as an error on reports that are submitted to HUD. So to avoid creating these issues, we really need to make sure we're doing this for every client every year. One thing to note, annual assessments are based solely on the head of household's anniversary date. So on the right-hand column, you'll see I have an example here for you. Client A. So ideally, they were enrolled in your program, let's say last summer, June 1st, 2019. Ideally, they will have an annual assessment done on June 1st, 2020. But you obviously have that 30-day window before and after. So the period in which you should do this annual assessment is May 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2020. If this sounds challenging to keep up with, try to think of a system that works for you and can help you keep track of this. Maybe you can put your client's anniversary date in a calendar as a reminder, or maybe you can think of another system that works better for you. Okay, I think that's, oh yeah, one last thing I wanted to note. Annual assessments are also a great opportunity to review that individual client situation. So you can take this opportunity to engage in a case management conversation with the client, because a year is a long time to be in a program, depending on what type of program it is. So why is this person still here? What types of services or resources have they received? Are they being connected with employment or benefits? I talked to a case manager at a training in Abilene last year who liked to ask their clients, what's your housing plan? So you can kind of let this be a time for you to check in with the client. Okay, I think that's everything for annual assessments, so now I'm going to hand things off to Marissa.
Hello everyone, I'm going to be talking about exiting enrollments and exit destinations, why exiting your clients is so important and how to choose the right exit destination. First, we've noticed that a lot of our providers aren't exiting their clients, especially for our emergency shelter and street outreach programs. I really can't stress enough how important this is for data quality. So when should you exit your client? For emergency shelter, if your client leaves the facility, exit them. If they return within the week or 7 days, then you can re-enroll them using the blue action button next to their enrollment and selecting re-enter the enrollment option. And if your client returns more than 7 days later to your facility, then you would do a completely new intake for them. For street outreach, this one is a little bit more complicated as your client doesn't necessarily leave from a street outreach program. So you would exit a client from street outreach if your client has entered another project type, for example, transitional housing or permanent supportive housing, or they found housing. If the client is engaged with another outreach worker or case manager. If the client has passed away. And finally, if you or the outreach team has been unable to locate the client for an extended period of time and there are no recorded contacts, typically 30 to 90 days. Also, I would like to let you all know that if your agency is having trouble remembering to exit your clients because of a heavy caseload or because you've been dealing with a lot of new issues or for any other reasons, then we can set up an auto exit feature for your organization. What this means is that your clients will be automatically exited from the program after a designated number of days. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about exit destinations and the importance of choosing the best fitting option for your client. To start off, I want to go over the options under the Other category. First, no exit interview completed. This option should only be chosen when it's the case. For example, if they disappear, if they leave without your knowledge. This option is the least helpful in terms of data collection, so please only choose this option when necessary. Choosing this option does count as a negative, but if it's the truth, then it's important to capture. I also want to take this time to note that no agency will ever have perfect data, so it's okay if you do have to choose this option. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about Other. According to HUD, this option should only be used as a last resort if the client's destination truly cannot even be loosely described by any of the other options. And if you do select this option, then an Other destination text box will pop up and will be required for you to fill out. In this text box, please be descriptive. Writing things like moved out of state or got a job isn't a housing destination and doesn't give us any destination information. So please make sure you are writing where the client will be staying, not why the client left. Next is Data Not Collected. This option is not interchangeable with no exit interview completed. Data Not Collected means you, the case manager, did not even try to collect the necessary information and equates to a null or missing data on reports. So when choosing an exit destination, please try and select the option that most loosely fits your client's destination. Exit reason. This field isn't required, but the more information gathered, the better. To wrap up on exit destinations, I want to remind you that this is all self-report. We do not want any assumptions. So if your client tells you that they are moving away or they got a job or if they're going back to school, make sure you are asking them where they will be staying when they leave and record as necessary. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about provider profiles. So what are provider profiles? These profiles are living records in HMIS of agencies that provide relevant services, such as housing, employment, and emergency services. Think of these as a directory of agencies with services in the balance of state. Why are they important? Provider profiles are important for tracking and recording referrals in HMIS. Also, please note, just because there's a provider profile for a certain agency in HMIS doesn't necessarily mean that agency has HMIS. This is why it's so important for assessors at entry points to make warm handoffs and why provider profiles are used mainly for tracking purposes. A warm handoff can look like picking up the phone and calling the agency to let them know about a client or even leaving a voicemail. How do they fit into the coordinated entry process? Provider profiles are an integral part of the referral process in coordinated entry. Assessors use provider profiles to track and record referrals. Receiving agencies with HMIS can use their provider profile to see a list of all referrals made to them. Receiving agencies without HMIS will not be able to see their provider profile and or the referrals made to them. However, it is still important to track these for entry point data. Communities can use referral records to understand which agencies are getting referrals and potentially involve those agencies in a larger discussion around ending homelessness. As a final reminder, please remember to make warm handoffs for every referral because the system is not perfect and we aren't perfect and sometimes the email addresses can be outdated. So making those phone calls is of utmost importance. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Antonio.
All right. So hello everyone. For my section, we'll be talking a little bit about the UDQ process. So to start things off, we're going to start with some basics about where to find the UDQ report, how to run the report, as well as a section on common data errors and corrections. All right, so as many of you already know, the UDQ process is a quarterly process, and you probably know that the UDQ process has begun because you would have received an email from me with the UDQ report. So that usually marks the beginning of the process. After you receive the report, depending on whether or not you have errors on it, you might need to go in and do some corrections. Whenever you're doing corrections, though, you're still going to need to periodically run the UDQ report. So even though you receive one UDQ report at the beginning of the process from us, you'll still need to know how to run the report yourself, because whenever you do go through the correction process, you have to periodically run that UDQ report to make sure that those errors are corrected. All right, so let's move into the first step. So once you're logged into ClientTrack, anywhere within ClientTrack, you should be able to see the workspace carousel, and that is designated by the arrows pointing in opposite directions right next to the large ClientTrack logo. After you click on that, you'll be brought to the workspace carousel. As for the reports workspace that we're looking for, it's the second to the last workspace. So if you're new to looking for the reports workspace, you might not see it at first glance. That's because you kind of have to scroll over a little bit. All right, so once you navigate over to the reports workspace, you should see a page, something like what's up on the slide right now. As you can see by the arrows, the first step would be to expand the HMIS reports section. And then below HMIS reports, you'll see the HUD data quality report. All right, so we'll click on that. You'll be brought to the reports parameters page. So what I'm going to point out on this parameters page are the absolutely minimum requirements or parameters that are set on your report before you run it. So the first thing that you need to have is a date range. If you are just running the report as part of the quarterly process, you can either put Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, depending on which quarter we're in. Next parameter that we need to take care of is organization. That should be automatically selected. The only time that's going to get a little trickier is if you're working with multiple organizations. In that case, you may need to double check that section to make sure that your organization is highlighted. All right, so we're going to scroll down on this UDQ parameter page, and we're going to get to the third parameter that I highly suggest choosing, which is filter by program. Especially now with coordinated entry and diversion being rolled out, we want to make sure that we're really specific about the programs that we choose, because not all programs are eligible for UDQ reports. And what I mean by that is not all programs are set up to be run through the UDQ report. All right, so in here, you want to make sure to choose your program. And then last step, you'll notice that I have the report and the export button highlighted. If you're doing this as part of the UDQ process, I would suggest running both of them. If you just want a quick glance, you might be able to get away with just running the report. All right, so here is an example of the UDQ report. A lot of you should be familiar with this. Q1 is the report validation table. It'll give you a lot of aggregate information. It'll give you some inflow and outflow information. After that, you'll see the Q2 personally identifiable information. here is really, it's going to give you a breakdown of responses. So if you got a lot of clients don't know, refused, missing information, unfortunately there's not much that we can do about client refused or missing information. So the sections that I really like to tell everyone to focus on is the Q3 and Q4 section. So these sections have what I like to think of as correctable errors. And you'll notice that in the Q3 section we have veteran status, project entry date, relationship to head of household, client location, and disabling condition. So this should look pretty familiar to a lot of you. And in the last section right here, Q4, we have destination, income and sources at start and exit, as well as the annual assessments. So for those of you that are familiar with the UDQ process, you should know that you should be pretty familiar with these two sections. So what I'm going to go into next are a couple of scenarios. I'm going to put some polls up on the screen. And what we're going to do is we're going to go over a few common data errors and how to correct them. All right. So for the first data error that we're going to go over, it's relationship to head of households. Okay. So I'm starting the poll now. You should see it on your screen. All right, so you can go ahead and type in your answers. I actually already see the right answer in here, so I'm pretty happy with that. All right, so all right, let's go on. All right. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and then broadcast these. All right. So the right answer, or the answer that I was looking for, was improperly exiting the head of household. So there's a couple of people who have actually entered that right one. So we'll go into these cause of errors. So the first one, we've got a couple of people that answered this. So missing head of household, and that's, you're completely right. Another cause is multiple head of households. So that was more of a curveball. This one, honestly, I've seen maybe once or twice. Missing head of household is usually the cause of this error. So let's go into corrections, okay? So the first step that I would take to correct this, and I'm going to show you some screenshots in a little bit, but the first one is to re-enter the workflow for the enrollments and then navigate to the enrollments page. Okay, so the reason we're going to navigate to the enrollments page is because on that page it'll actually give you every case member and it'll tell you their relationship to the head of household. Okay, so once you're on that enrollments page, you're going to want to investigate each of those case members and family members to make sure that you have a head of household designated. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. So here is a dashboard, a client's dashboard. If you click on the blue action button, you'll see these options pop up. And the option that we're going to click to re-enter the workflow is the very first one. And that one says edit project entry workflow. All right. So once you're on this page, you'll actually need to click on through to the third section, which is program enrollment. And once you're on this page, you'll see what you see here on the screen. But it's all of the case members. So these are all of the household members that are included in the enrollment. All right, so if you take a look over here at relationship to head of household, you'll notice that there's Currently, no one designated as self, so S-E-L-F, self, and self is sort of the relationship used for the head of household. Okay, so if there's no self here, you know that that's a red flag. After that, you might need to do a little more digging to see what happened to the self, right? What happened to the head of households. I would say that the most common cause of this is that the head of household was exited from the enrollment, but the rest of the household was not. So that's this scenario that we're looking at here. So in this case, it would depend on what actually happened, right? So was it just a head of household that left, and is there a new head of household taking care of these, taking care of the children? If that's the case, you may want to change one of the parents or the spouse over to the head of household. If that's not the case, let's say the whole family was actually supposed to be exited, then you'll just want to go back and exit all the family members, and you want to make sure that the exit date is set to the same date as the head of household's exit. That way, it looks like they all exited at the same time. All right, so y'all did pretty good on that one. Let's go on to the second common data error and correction. Okay, so for this one, let's see. I'm going to put the poll up right now. All right, let's see what everyone thinks is the cause of a missing client location. All right, awesome. All right, I see one answer that I really like. Head of household is missing location on the entry assessments. I wish I could see who sent in that answer, but you get an A+. That's exactly the answer that I was looking for. All right, so cause of the error, head of household missing location. And the second cause, missing entry assessment. Usually these go hand in hand. The reason these go hand in hand is because the location data element exists on the entry assessment. So if you don't have the entry assessment, you won't have the location. Awesome. So how would we go about identifying this issue? The way we identify it is by checking the enrollment and seeing if there's an entry assessment. So the only time this gets tricky and a little tedious is whenever there are multiple enrollments within the date range, right? So let's say we are looking for just one quarter, 3 months. And let's say the client came in and out of multiple shelters within those 3 months. That's the one downside, is that we will need to check, hopefully you catch the one that's missing the entry assessment on the first shot, but chances are you might have to check a couple. All right, so we're actually going to go through how to actually do this. Okay, so it's really similar to how we checked the case members. We're going to click on the blue action button again, but instead of clicking on Edit Project Entry Workflow, we're actually going to click on Associated Assessments. Okay, so I use this option a lot. Once you get over to the Associated Assessments page, you should see something like what I have on the screen right now. On the top example, you'll notice that this client has an entry assessment. Then you'll notice on the bottom that he doesn't. So this is just to show you how it looks. If you don't see an entry assessment on an enrollment, that's always a red flag. We're always going to need that entry assessment. All right. So let's move on to the next one, missing annual. So this one is not going to be an open-ended question. I actually gave you all a couple of options to click on. So I'm going to go ahead and open this. All right, so what are the causes? An annual assessment 45 days from the yearly enrollment anniversary, an annual assessment 15 days from the yearly enrollment, or a client has been in the program for 1 year and has no annual assessment. All right, I'm seeing some good answers. This one is, you can select multiple answers, right? So there could be 1, there could be 2, or there could be none. Who knows? Well, anyway, y'all are doing great, actually. So you're right. The last one was the answer. Client has been in the program for 1 year and has no annual assessment. But there's actually one other answer in here, and 8 of you've got it, and it's the first one, which is an annual assessment 45 days from the yearly enrollment anniversary. So that's a little bit of a curveball, because if you read very deep into the manual, you'll know that the annual assessment should be completed within 30 days of the yearly anniversary. Okay? So that one was a little tricky. But yeah, so if a client's been there for 1 year and there's no annual, you'll get that error. If you do have an annual assessment but you're still getting the error, it's probably because it falls outside of the date range, so just be aware of that. All right, so what's the correction? We need to identify the enrollment that's missing the annual assessment. This process is going to be pretty much exactly the same as how we were searching for enrollments that were missing entry assessments. Okay, and again, if you have multiple enrollments, you might have to check multiple of them. All right, so we're starting off exactly the same. We're going to click on that blue action button. We're going to click on Associate Assessments, and then we're just going to check to see if there's an annual in there. In the first example, there's no annual. On the second one, it is there. So that's pretty straightforward. All right, so let's power on through the rest of these questions. All right, so destination. I'm about to put the poll up for this destination error. All right, so what causes the destination data error? Awesome, yeah. Right off the bat, y'all got it. There's one person that keeps on putting entry assessment. Well, that's all right. That's why we're here. All right, so let's move. So I've got it broadcast, and you're right. So the destination is taken during the exit assessment, right? Because that is us asking the client, hey, where are you going after this? So one cause of this error is a missing exit assessment. Second cause, data not collected set as the destination. So I'm actually going to go into some of these corrections. This data error is a little tricky. So if the client has a destination, it probably means that they exited, right? So after a client has exited, it's hard to get in contact with them. So these data errors, I just have to be straightforward and say it's unlikely to correct. If you have data not collected in the exit assessment, it's probably because they disappeared. And if that's the case, you know, it is what it is. We won't be able to get that information back. So here I have is, you know, if you, on the off chance, had a really good relationship with the client and maybe you have his phone number, sure, you can reach out to them. But again, for the most part, I don't think that's going to be the solution. All right, so let's take a look at one more. Income sources at start and exit. Okay, so the poll is actually only going to be referring to the exit. So what causes income and sources at exit data error? All right, so excellent job. So the question, this was a little tricky. So the question is only referring to the exit income. So the cause of, you know, the question in the poll it should be missing exit assessment and data not collected set as income. All right. So, if you have income and sources missing at start, it could be caused by the missing entry assessment. Yeah, if you have income and sources at exit, it's probably caused by a missing exit assessment. Or data not collected set as income. So again, the correction for this one, similar to destinations, unlikely, especially if it's at exit, just because the client is gone and you can't get in contact with them. So that's why it's so important to really try and capture it while the client is still with you. All right, so let's forge on ahead. We've got a couple more things to cover. So as you're going through these corrections, a lot of you know that not all corrections can be done by you, right? So if it's an issue of assessment dates not matching, yeah, you can edit the assessment dates. But for things like client merges, enrollment deletions, service deletions, you'll need to get in contact with the help desk. So what I kind of want to go over today is how to communicate with the help desk, essentially. Especially recently, we've seen a number of tickets missing a lot of crucial information. So we're just going to cover a few basics about what information needs to be on your help desk tickets. All right, so if you send in a help desk ticket and afterwards you receive an email notification that looks like this, this means that someone wrote a note on your ticket and they're waiting for you to respond. So if someone leaves a note on your ticket, a lot of times it's because we need a little more information in order to make sure we're deleting the correct enrollment. It might seem like a pain, but the thing is that we have to be 100% sure before we delete something, because once you delete it, it's gone. So please double check your email notifications, because if there's a note, that means that someone's waiting for you to respond before we can take action. Okay, so we can't take action with half information. Okay, we need a little bit more than that. All right, so where do you find your submitted tickets? You'll click on the workspace carousel. You'll go to the first workspace, which is your home workspace. And then you'll click on the last option under My Client Track, and it's My Submitted Issues. Okay? So once you click on that link, you'll be brought to a page that looks like this, and it should have all of your client track tickets that you submitted in here. And there's even a column that says status. So if you see one with a status of waiting for a response, well, it means someone's waiting for your response. All right. So let's go into a help desk ticket template. So this isn't going to apply for to everyone. A lot of you that are help desk all-stars, you provide plenty of information, and thank you so much for that. This is really for, who knows, newer people, maybe someone forgot to enter in some information. But this is just here as sort of best practice. So whenever you're starting off a ticket, let us know what's the issue right off the bat. You'll be surprised how much I have to read into a ticket before I actually know what someone's talking about. Okay, so let's try to be as explicit as possible. And just go ahead and start it off. Say, hey, I've got a bug, I've got a merge, I've got a deletion. You can start off with those, okay? Afterwards, if it has to do with a client, make sure you include the client ID. If you need us to merge clients, include both of them. Next, let's move into enrollments. If you need us to delete an enrollment, please give us the name and dates. This one's been happening a lot, where I'll just receive a ticket that says, can you delete the duplicate enrollment? Well, which one? There's two that look exactly the same, right? So please give us a little more information. Same goes for service dates. If you want us to delete a service, please provide the date that the service was received, because a lot of times the service was provided on multiple dates. If you need us to delete an assessment, not only tell us what kind of an assessment it was, entry, exit, the date of the assessment, but also the enrollment that assessment was attached to, right? So you could say, on the COC emergency shelter enrollments assessment, entry assessment on January 1st. that'll take care of things for us. And lastly, you can type your issue out. Okay, so from here on out, if we receive tickets without enough information, we're going to end up responding with the ticket template. We're just going to say, hey, there wasn't enough information. Can you please respond with these missing fields? For those of you that are great at it, keep on doing what you're doing. All right, so I appreciate y'all listening in. The PowerPoint is there for you to download, but this brings us to the end of the webinar.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you have any questions, Victoria has something she wants to say really quick.
Yes, sorry. I know that we are running up against some time here, and of course, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in. I do want to very quickly demonstrate how to go and enter the move-in date for permanent housing enrollments. That was a question that Maria Maldonado had a little while ago, and instead of just getting back to just her, I think it would be a good idea if everyone could see that. It's not going to take very long, so I am going to share my screen here very quickly. And this is a test client that has rapid rehousing on their dashboard. And these steps are also going to be the same if your client is in permanent supportive housing or COC, rapid rehousing. You're just going to click on the blue action button. You're going to edit project entry workflow. If there's nothing that needs to be updated on the client information, then you'll click on no changes. Same for family members. I'm going to save and close. There's nothing to change there. And then on the program enrollment page, this is where you're going to see the housing move-in date. You will only have one housing move-in date per household. You're only going to fill this out for the head of household or self. You're not going to fill it out for any other client, not the spouse, not any children. It's just going to be on the head of household. So once you enter in that date, and again, there's this little calendar here that you can click on the date or just manually type it in, click on save. And then once that's done, you can cancel the workflow. And we should see on the client's dashboard that they now have a move-in date. And that is it. Please let us know if any of you have any questions. We'll be here for the next few minutes. Otherwise, thank you for your time. We always enjoy putting on these webinars. We're always super excited at the number of people who come on. And thanks for your participation. See you later, guys.